Welcome, everybody. This is Educational Norm. I'm your host, Norm Potter. I'm glad you could make it here tonight. And if you are not with me live, hopefully you'll check this out later. Today is September 22nd. We are on episode 2 of Educational Norm, and we are talking about Webb's depth of knowledge, which if you're a teacher here in Ohio, this is something you really need to know. And I'm going to help walk through some of the ins and outs of Webb's DOK and how I've used it in the past for some of the work that I've done with other teachers, and also how I've used it personally. Before we go any further, make sure you subscribe to the channel so we can get our 1,000 viewers, so we can be live in person and on time every single time. I noticed I had 1 viewer and they already left, so hopefully the channel will start picking up a little bit, but I will still maintain this channel just so people can use it for professional development when they need it. So tonight we are talking about Webb's depth of knowledge, and if you're not familiar with Webb's depth of knowledge, it's a theory that's based on Bloom's taxonomy. And when we started using this back a few years ago in Ohio, we had to get up to speed on what it meant. And I found so much value in it. I've actually created other avenues of using Webb's depth of knowledge, not just for curriculum development, but also for evaluations of teachers and staff and programs and other things of that nature. So it really is an important piece of work to consider. And I did notice when I was working with some schools from Michigan over the summer that it may not be as well known as I thought it was, just because it is an Ohio thing. In our system, it's something that we have to know, but other states may not have that requirement, so it may be well known in all the other states that might be listening. So if you're not familiar with it, like I said, it is based on Bloom's taxonomy. And if you look at how it goes about, if you considered a standard that you have to teach, there are 4 levels in Webb's depth of knowledge that you could cover for that standard. The first level is the most basic level, and that's the recall and reproduce level of information. So if we're talking about the depth of understanding for a student, and you give them basic information and they can recall that information and they can reproduce that information on a test or just verbally, then that is the basic level. They know that standard exists. They know that information exists. They can't do much with it, but they know what it is. Definition, that the star is named such and such, or a planet is named Jupiter or something like that. But it really is very basic knowledge. A lot of times we get stuck in middle school and high school with some basic knowledge stuff with complex questions, but they're still looking for basic knowledge by asking basic definitions or fill in the blank or something of that nature. So when we're teaching a concept, that would be the first part of a learning process potentially. Just because these are labeled 1, 2, 3, and 4 does not necessarily mean you have to start with level 1 in all cases. Sometimes you might have a kid work on a very complex problem, and then through that process, like in a PBL, they might get some of the basic skills they need to fill in the blanks on what they need for that complex statement. So you can work backwards. It's not as common, obviously, but it's one of those things that you can mess around with and see where it fits in for your teaching. Level 2 in Webb's depth of knowledge is skills and concepts, where you take the information that you've learned and you're able to put it to use and show a skill, and it might be basic in the production of that skill or the understanding of the concept, but you can put it to use. I look at teaching this way often. Level 1, you know what teaching is. Level 2 is you have lessons that are out there and you are able to use those lessons and apply them to your classroom. There are a lot of people that will take things from Pinterest, for instance, and then use those in the classroom, and the result might, be a high level of engagement. But the actual process of learning that as a teacher and putting the lesson together is more of a level 2, because you are borrowing that from somebody and able to implement that in your classroom. So that's a level 2, in my opinion. And I know that sometimes my opinion is a little different than others, but that's where I see level 2 for teachers. So it's taking that skill and be able to use that skill in an effective way. Level 3 is what we try to strive for most often in the state of Ohio when it comes to the state testing. Rarely will we get to level 4, if ever, on state testing, but level 3 is where they want you to be, and it's called strategic thinking. Strategic thinking is exactly what it sounds like. you're using your thinking to produce a strategy to solve a problem, using that knowledge that you've gained on that standard and being able to use it and come up and solve real world problems. Those are unique issues that may be able to come up in like a science class or a math class or even an English class when you're writing a paper. But the level 3 standard of learning for Webb's DOK is to be able to be strategic in your thinking. So going back to that teacher piece where we had level 1, you know what teaching is, and level 2, you borrow a lesson from somebody and you're able to apply it effectively. Level 3 is now you're considering the whole picture of your classroom and possibly even the grade level team and developing lessons accordingly based on the need of your students and also the needs of the school. So it really does become a much more strategic piece. And it could even be something that you would consider a year-long plan of how things are going to evolve from day 1 to day 180 and how that progression and that periodization might work through a whole school year and how you can build and spiral skills throughout the whole year. Very strategic, and you really have to know your stuff to be able to do level 3 because you're implementing all these basic skills that you have and the knowledge that you've gained to be able to do strategic thinking inside of your own little bubble. And that is difficult. And it's something that, you know, we all start. And when we do this with kids, it really is giving them a real world problem. And this is where community partners come in and are able to give a real world problem that they can work on and then be able to combine their knowledge from various subjects to create this unique situation. Now, what I just described actually borders a little bit on level 4, which is the extended thinking. And extended thinking is taking those concepts that you have learned and using them in a different way, a way that nobody else has ever used them before, and creating something new. It's taking part of A and part of B and creating something that nobody has used before. That's a C. And so when you start looking at your curriculum, there are things that you can do to encourage that level 4 thinking, and how you set that up in your room really is an encouragement type thing. It allows that differentiation within a standard that they can go beyond what is expected, even at a level 3, and create something brand new by bringing in, let's say, their science topic into English and creating a unique type of scientific journal that is the new way of keeping records for experiments or things of that nature. And the kids will have a blast with that. One of the problems that we'll be working on with the school here shortly is a representative from a major cell phone carrier is going to ask students to try to develop a 5G network within their own community. So when you start looking at that, because their community is unique, there are certain things they would have to know about how 5G works and the science behind it. But when it comes down to it, when they design a system that works within their own town, it will be unique to that situation. And so they're creating something brand new, and they're going to combine their science, their community knowledge, because it will take some government interaction to be able to pull that kind of thing off. It will also need some math and geometry of those things of that nature. So it really is an integrated unit that combines a lot of different things to create this brand new thing within their town. So when you start looking at all these different pieces of Webb's depth of knowledge, it really is something you have to consider as a teacher to be more effective in the classroom. What I see as the standards for the state of Ohio is sort of like the commander's intent within the armed forces. A commander's intent is where you have the person in charge that gives the order, that sees the big picture. If you can picture those old-time World War II movies where they're standing around a map and moving their the strategic pieces around the map to try to figure out where they should go next. The commander has a general overview of what should be happening with the big picture. But when the commander decides to take an area, they said, we want this area taken by this date. The people on the ground are the ones that have to come up with the actual plan because they know the terrain, they know where people are already stationed, they know what the enemy has been doing over the past 2 or 3 weeks or whatever it may be. And so the people on the ground have to know that intent, that they want that hill taken at a very specific time. The details of how they do it really is decided by the people on the ground. So that's how I sort of see the standards. The state has come up with this big plan of how everything works. And if you look at all the standards that are out there in the state of Ohio, we're talking, we have, if you were to teach every single standard K through senior year, you would have about 3,000 different standards to teach. And I know that doesn't happen just because not everybody has drama and world languages in elementary and that kind of thing. But they have the big picture. The state has the big picture with these standards. It's our job to look at those standards and be able to interpret those and get to the intent of those standards. Now, a couple of years ago, a group of teachers and I went to a professional development where we were unpacking standards. As a group, we were able to sit down and decide at what level these standards are. And not every standard is created equal. Some standards are written so the students would only have to be at a level 1 in Webb's DOK, and others would want you at a level 3, like a compare and contrast writing of some sort, could be a level 3. So we are breaking down these standards, and we were given a standard, and it took us, I want to say 2 hours to break down a single standard. And at the end of that 2 hours, the teachers and I were talking, we all decided as a group that there's no way a teacher is going to be able to do this on their own and really spend the time of 2 hours for every standard. It's just not reasonable. It's not feasible. So that got me to think about the Webb's depth of knowledge and how it could be used in this situation. Since we're teaching a standard at a grade level, and let's say I use a standard of, let's say a science standard they have here in front of me, the Earth's crust consists of major and minor tectonic plates that move relative to each other. If that's the standard, we know, because we've been in education long enough, that within the structure of our classroom, we're going to have students at every range on Webb's depth of knowledge. We'll have students that have never heard of a tectonic plate, and we'll have the daughter of a geologist that knows everything about tectonic plates and probably could teach the course for that one. I probably would let her. But with that range, unpacking the standard really doesn't help because we still have to scaffold our level 1 to be able to get them to level 2 and 3. So our thought as a group when we were there was to make sure that every standard has different ideas for each level of understanding that the kids are already at. So we can either scaffold them up to where we want them to be, or we can push them beyond where they're at and move them forward. So that is the idea of how we could use Webb's depth of knowledge. If we still understand the standard the way it is written and what the intent is, we'll be able to create our own plan because every classroom will be unique. You and I both know that if we have a second period class, they may function great that day, and my third period class may not function at all. And now we have to start 2 different classes with the same topic. And it might just be because the level of understanding, the prior knowledge that they brought into that lesson wasn't the same. And so now we have to be able to be prepared for all ranges of kids. So that's what the advantage of using Webb depth of knowledge and preparing these lessons is, to make sure you're covering these different levels so you can scaffold that information. Science teachers in Ohio, you have a little different issue. You don't use Webb's depth of knowledge, but you do use the Ohio cognitive demands of science. And if you look at them side by side, you'll find that Webb depth of knowledge and the cognitive demands that the Ohio State uses are very, very similar. At the level 1, for the recall and reproduce part of Webb's depth of knowledge, for your science demands, it's called recalling accurate science. Based on my previous information to you about recall and reproduce, it's basically that. You're recalling and reproducing scientific information. When you get to level 2, where it's skills and concepts, the science demand is interpreting and communicating science concepts. So the words are very similar. We have concepts in both. Science does take it a little bit further and have the communication piece, which I think needs to be across the board, reading and writing across the curriculum. We hear that all the time. But I also think that math should be across the curriculum. So you could also flip that into an English classroom and make it very effective. But the communication piece is something that is just tied into that part of their depth of knowledge, and it makes perfect sense. Level 3, if you recall, was strategic thinking for Bloom's taxonomy. And for the science piece, it's called demonstrating science knowledge. The strategic thinking was to get that bigger picture. And when you're demonstrating scientific knowledge, you're going through the scientific process and be able to demonstrate that skill and the knowledge you gained in an experiment, for instance. You could be doing that. So again, very similar. It's a production of a higher level skill, a higher level thought process, and it turns out to be that deep thinking that's needed to show that you're growing. And the last part, again, is that extended thinking for Bloom's taxonomy, where it's taking something and creating new things. And so when we get into that for our science delivery, the level 4 they have is designing technological engineering solutions using scientific concepts. Again, perfectly the same idea. It really is developing things based on the need to solve a problem. And when you look at it that way, Webb's depth of knowledge and the cognitive demands of science that the state of Ohio uses are basically one and the same when you start thinking that way. Now, what makes it easier for teachers in this regard? If you really want to get to level 3 and 4, a very simple way of doing it is, going back to my solution-centered mindset that I brought up last week, and thinking about how you can integrate other subjects into your topic. I already mentioned writing and reading across the curriculum. I worked with a group of 7th grade math teachers at one point that we did some things with basic skills, but when we came to writing in their classrooms, it became very evident that the writing was the kids' reasoning behind how they did work. And for them to explain the work that they were doing and having to actually verbalize and communicate where they were struggling and what their thought process was, it helped their reasoning skills way beyond what we ever expected. And it even got to the point where when the teachers didn't ask for the reason, the kids would communicate it anyway because they wanted to make sure they understood and got the right feedback to improve their skill. It really was a great thing to see. And I think the one math teacher summed it up best. Julie, this goes out to you. She said, nothing changed for writing in my kids other than my own expectations. Because before this whole push to write across their curriculum, the kids would come in and write a sentence. But once she expected more, because they could write a full paper in English, so they could write a full paper in math, they just weren't expected to do so. So once the teacher decided that was her expectation, the writing came across the curriculum the way it should have. So it really was an interesting trend and also a great observation on that teacher's part about how her expectations really set the tone for what the students would do. Now, going back to Webb's depth of knowledge for teachers. Again, I've already mentioned a few times that you have the basic understanding of teaching, and I'm working with some college kids right now. That's where they're at. They have a very simple view of where they're at currently with teaching philosophies and understanding how to make lesson plans and those types of things. They just haven't been taught. At level 2, if I gave them a lesson, they may or may not be able to teach that really well at this point, but it's something that as an experienced teacher, you could definitely take a lesson that I give you and you would be able to perform that, and it wouldn't take a lot of thought on your part, but you do know the ways to reach kids. You do know the ways to make it interesting. Those are the parts that go into that level 2. And level 3, designing your own lesson plans that may integrate with others. But even if they don't, you have a long-term idea of what you need to do, a scope and sequence, a pacing guide, curriculum maps. All those things come out because you are organized and you're strategically thinking about how you want to approach this. That would also include when you know that there are going to be areas of concern that your students always struggle with that you now anticipate and are able to squash before it ever happens. In that level 4, you are developing a new curriculum, a new way of delivery, a new product, a new way of hooking kids in, a new way of turning information in. And we all did level 4 to some extent through that pandemic. So you got to give yourself a little bit of credit to learning that whole new process. So just to recap, if you have more questions about Webb's depth of knowledge and the 4 levels, again, recall, reproduce, skills and concepts, strategic thinking, and extended thinking. If you want more examples, feel free to contact me at norm@normpotter.com, or you can leave a comment and I will see that later. I hope this has been informative for you. And if you have suggestions for the next Educational Norm broadcast, please send them my way and I'll see if I can help you with your personal PD. I have no problem specializing every week to somebody's needs. So just let me know. And I'm going to have Nick play us out here. And until next week, again, we'll do it 7 o'clock next week. Until next week, be kind, be professional, and find solutions. Have a good evening.
So let's come together in the darkest night. May the strong hold the weaker, hold the weak up to the light. Yeah, I am not a sinner nor saint, just a common man who wants to see more love, more care, more change. I am a writer of a song who wants to make a sound that'll give you hope to carry on. And if you look into my